Okay, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our fifth and final webinar for Autism Awareness Month. In this webinar, we're going to look at inclusive lesson planning. So what we're going to do is we're going to take everything that we've looked at from the first four webinars and bring it together within the explicit instruction model and have a look at what that might look like in your classroom. As always, you'll get a copy of the PowerPoint once the webinar is finished by email, and the video of this webinar will be posted on our social media pages. So just to remind, one of the reasons this is important is, especially in the current climate where support services are difficult to access, the NCCD allows schools to impute a disability. So impute the four categories of disability: cognitive disability, social, emotional, sensory, and physical disability. But to do that process, it requires a lot of evidence and a lot of ruling things out. And it's important to know your learner and target that support to ensure that we're not imputing a disability when that cause could be something else. So when we look at putting everything within the inclusive lesson planning today, we're going to look at how we can put it within the explicit instruction model. So that idea that the teacher models talking out his or her thoughts so the student can hear what the teacher's thinking and see what the teacher's doing. Then the teacher models with the students. This process includes maybe sometimes acting a bit silly, go, oh, I've forgotten what to do here. Who in the class can remind me what to do? So including the students in that process of modeling. Then the students working in groups, mixed groups, and then the students working individually. And everything we look at from now to the end will be within that explicit instruction framework. So in the first webinar where we looked at developing an inclusive curriculum, deconstructing the curriculum, we looked at teachers collaboratively looking at the content descriptors in the Australian curriculum. So, and then talking about them and identifying what is the essential knowledge to be taught in the content descriptors and what is the essential skills to be modeled. So here's an example where we've broken down a content descriptor to the essential knowledge and essential skills by defining those cognitive verbs. And that's the C part of that case model from ACARA looking at personalized learning. And when we break those content descriptors down into their essential knowledge and essential skills, that's what teachers model and scaffold during the first two stages of the explicit instruction model. So when the teacher's individually modeling, he or she is modeling their essential skills in the content descriptors and teaching the knowledge. And when the teacher's modeling with the students, saying we're related to the content descriptions in the Australian curriculum. The teachers collaboratively then discuss the achievement standards in the Australian curriculum. What are the achievement standards requiring students to demonstrate, and what is it not requiring the students to demonstrate? And here's another example where we've got an achievement standard from mathematics, and we've deconstructed into what is the students required to demonstrate and what are the students not required to demonstrate. And then we think about the case models for personalized learning from ACARA. And we put the achievement standards into the last two parts of the explicit instruction model. So when students are working in groups and students are working individually, they're working towards the deconstructed achievement standards. In the second webinar, we looked at identifying the strengths and barriers to learning for a whole class, because Universal Design for Learning really focuses on that tier one of supporting all learners to access the learning process. And if you work for the Queensland Department of Education, in their 2023 Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Framework, it talks about the importance of having a school-wide approach to doing this. And so this might be something that you consider. The definition of universal design for learning talks about it being an approach that considers the needs of all learners from the beginning. So if that's the case, we need to be able to identify what are the students' strengths and barriers to learning. So to do that, we use this simple framework. We identify the common characteristics for our students, then associated strengths and associated barriers to learning, or if you think about the NCCD, functional impacts. So we've identified our common characteristics for groups of students. Then we've thought about the associated student strengths, because Notice these aren't nice and kind because nice and kind aren't strengths that we can use to leverage the learning process. If I see nice and kind as the only strengths a student has, it really tells me a school doesn't know much about their learner. Then identifying the associated barriers to learning or functional impacts. Notice we've got initials there that could be used in the nationally consistent collection of data to demonstrate to the federal government that we know our students with disabilities barriers to the learning process. And we did the same thing for individual students and looked at how we could do that same mapping process for maybe students, individual students with disability or other diverse learning needs. Then we looked at the Universal Design for Learning framework coming out of Harvard University. Once again, it's not a set of strategies. So it's not a set of strategies that you teach, it's a problem-solving tool. So it consists of 3 principles. The green column is I engage kids in the learning process in multiple ways. The purple column is principle 2. When I teach the knowledge and model the essential skills in the content descriptors, I do it in multiple ways. And the third column, the blue column, relates to the achievement standards in the Australian curriculum. When the students demonstrate the achievement standards, they can do it in multiple ways. Each one of these boxes are referred to as guidelines, and they provide a more targeted approach. And then within each one of these guidelines, there's dot points called checkpoints, and they're more targeted ways of supporting students. But what happens is when we identify our students' strengths and barriers to learning or functional impacts, we can then look at this framework and look at ways that we can overcome those barriers to support students to engage with the learning process and overcome their barriers. So in this case, we've got our common characteristics for our group of students, our associated strengths and barriers to learning. Then we look at the UDL framework and we identify what are potential checkpoints that we could use to overcome those barriers to the learning process. Once we've identified those UDL checkpoints, they're not strategies, they're just ways to support students to overcome their barriers. We then need to think about strategies. What I really like about the UDL framework is it doesn't tell us the strategy. As long as it fits within the aim of that checkpoint, it's something we can use. So you might use strategies that you're very comfortable with rather than having to constantly learn new strategies. We then identify those targeted strategies that will help achieve those UDL checkpoints and help our learners overcome those barriers to the learning process. Once again, thinking about the NCCD with those targeted strategies, we can then use initials of our students with disability to show the federal government that we've identified our students' barriers to the learning process and targeted strategies to overcome them. Once we've done that, we can take these strategies and we can be discerning about where we put it within the explicit instruction model. So we looked at the explicit instruction model before, the teacher individually modeling for students, teacher modeling with the students working in groups and individually. So when the teacher's individually modeling and with the students, the content descriptions, the targeted strategies that relate to principle 1 of engagement and principle 2 of representation related to the UDL framework, we could put those in here. When the students are working in groups and individually towards the achievement standards, principle 1 of engagement still applies, but principle 3 around action and expression, the strategies related to those UDL checkpoints are then useful. So really this process is deconstructing what we know, identifying what will work, know that will work, and then slowly embedding it all like a jigsaw into that explicit instruction model. At our yesterday's webinar, so last night's webinar, we looked at 5 potential strategies at that tier 1 of support that we could use to support students using teacher aids. So one was rotating roles when we've got our kids working in groups, having the teacher and teacher aid move to different groups, having the teacher aid, making a teacher aid a visible part of that explicit instruction model. So the teacher might be explaining something and then the teacher aid models it or vice versa. The teacher aide might explain something to the class and the teacher models it. Using the teacher aide to provide teaching triage. So when the teacher's modeling a skill or teaching some knowledge, the teacher aide walks around the room and identifies who needs the most help, then the next and so forth, then goes over to the teacher and says, these are the kids who need priority support and you need to support them. So then the teacher goes and supports those students, and then the teacher aide supports the remainder of the class. The teacher aide might supplement that whole class instruction with other skills or help students with readiness to learn. When we think about those 5 strategies, we also think about where they fit within the explicit instruction model. For example, if rotating roles during group work, that's not going to be useful when the teacher's modeling for students. So if we're going to use our teacher aide that way, it goes to the specific time within the explicit instruction model. And so if we have a teacher aide and we're planning our lessons and we're building them into the explicit instruction model, we can think about how we use our teacher aide. The final thing we're going to have a look at today is these first 4 columns are really focused on that tier 1 support, universal design for learning, support quality differentiated teaching practice. But we know that there are kids in our classes who need more than universal design, and that's where our adjustments come in play. So when we've mapped out our individual students, so we've worked out their characteristics, strengths, and functional impacts, and we've identified specific strategies for them, we can then put them into our adjustments, our instructional, environmental, and curriculum adjustments. But what's really important about universal design, because it is that foundation of tier 1, many of the strategies in this targeted strategies will support our individual students. So by ensuring these happen, we need to hopefully do less of those instructional, environmental, and curriculum adjustments. And notice that we've got the curriculum adjustments blocked out for the first 3 rows of the explicit instruction model, because ACARA says to us that the classroom teachers should teach the content descriptions of the students' chronological age or year level, and then students can demonstrate along the achievement standard spectrum. So that's in that final stage where you see different achievement standard year levels. So thank you for joining us for the last for these 5 webinars. Remember, when you join our webinars, think about 3 things that you might implement or try committing to at your school and try to put in place. If you're interested in our work, everything we create with teachers goes on Teachers Pay Teachers. I'd strongly encourage you to have a look at those. Everything is free. This is our final Autism Awareness Month webinar, but we are offering full-day workshops. If you're interested, please share your colleagues or sign up yourself. If your school's interested in hosting a workshop but budgets are tight, remember, if you provide us with a free venue, we'll provide your school with at least 4 free tickets. We cover all expenses and we travel all over the country. So if you're interested, please email us. Sorry, I left off the .com at the bottom of that email. Everything we create is on our social media pages. We share educational research from around the world for teachers to discern. So I'd strongly encourage you to have a look at those. And once again, thank you for joining us for our 5 webinars. As I said, at the end of this webinar, I'll email out the PowerPoint to everyone, and a copy of the video will go on our social media pages. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a great night.